don't go believing anything I say. No, don't go believing me. No, don't listen to me. Don't take any notice. Don't listen to anything that I say. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome.
The COVID-19 vaccinations are now under criminal investigation with CID police station in Hammersmith in London. So, Met Police investigation.
We will be lifting the Plan B measures and returning to our original Plan A. We'll shortly be hearing from the Chief Medical Advisor to the UK Health Security Agency, Dr. Susan Hopkins. But before we do, and earlier today, that's why we announced 3 important changes as part of our return to Plan A. The government is ending the guidance on working from home.
Also, this case is being acknowledged by the International Criminal Court in The Hague.
Second, from the start of next Thursday, mandatory certification on vaccines and tests will end. Third, also starting next Thursday, we'll no longer legally mandate wearing of face masks.
The filing has been acknowledged by the International Criminal Court on the 6th of December 2021.
Because we cannot eradicate this virus.
There is significant and irrefutable forensic evidence and hundreds of witness statements from victims, whistleblowers and experts to confirm serious harm, injury and death caused by the COVID-19 vaccines.
We cannot eradicate this virus and its future variants. Instead, we must learn to live with COVID in the same way that we learned to live with flu, to think about what they can do to help keep the virus at bay. Whether it's washing your hands, getting in fresh air, or getting tested and self-isolating if you're positive. Help us keep this success story going.
It's also important to note that there are only 703 patients in mechanical ventilation beds. And that's at a level that is as low as last July, when we also opened up in this country. And here you show the amazing progress that we have made, with 52 million people who having received their first dose. More than 48 million people on their second dose, and 36.6 having received their booster a third dose, That's two-thirds of the eligible population in this country. What you can see on the slide, the first graph, is the levels of protection in individuals who are admitted to the intensive care unit. And if you focus on the red colouring, what you can see in that is more than half the people being admitted to ICU over the last 7 or 8 months are unvaccinated. And if you also see the smaller proportion that have had 2 doses and a booster, in comparison to the general population. And you can see in the general population, only 10% of individuals are unvaccinated.
Now we're going to turn to questions, and the first 2 questions are for members of the public, and I believe the first one. Next, I believe it's Michelle from Lincolnshire.
Please can you explain why the self-isolation period is changed to 5 days with negative lateral flow tests, when right from the beginning of the pandemic it has been advised that if you have had COVID, then you shouldn't do a lateral flow or PCR test for 90 days, as you could have false results. This question needs to be answered as people are losing faith in the system.
Susan, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, so what we know is that you can remain PCR positive for quite some time, which is why we don't advise repeated PCR tests unless you've got new symptoms. However, lateral flow and the evidence for lateral flow has come hard and fast over the last 6 to 9 months. And what we recognise now is that once individuals have finished their infectious episode, those lateral flow tests become negative, and remain negative for the vast majority of people, and remain negative for the vast majority of people, is that the individuals who have 2 negative lateral flows can be released from isolation early. The earliest that can be is after their 5 and 6 and release on day 6. 5 and 6 and release on day 6. So it's really an emerging evidence and changing the evidence base rather than any new advice in that way.
Susan, did you want to say anything on the self-isolation rules as well?
Well, I mean, I would just add that for the vast majority of conditions, either self-isolation as cases or self-isolation as contacts of cases isn't a legal requirement. Even now, people are as cases within the rules, they are able to take testing to leave early. And as contacts, if you're vaccinated, you're able to leave every day. Either self-isolation as cases or self-isolation as contacts of cases isn't a legal requirement. Having done a daily lateral flow test, those lateral flow tests become negative and remain negative for the vast majority of people. Isn't a legal requirement.
May I remind you that you work for the people. You do not work for the government.
That would be different, but a legal requirement is only one component of it.
Now, if you were wondering, which I'm sure you are, why you have not yet heard about this.
And again, when it comes to what has happened in number 10, the photos and videos and things that we've all seen, and we've all understandably, I think all of us have been pained by that, angered by that. It is right for the Prime Minister to respond, and he has responded in Parliament, and he will come back to Parliament once the investigation is complete. And I think that is the right approach.
There is a deliberate blanket campaign of misinformation underway by the government and the mainstream media.
In terms of what happens at the end of March, I think first of all we can reflect on the last 8 weeks. That's what it's been. I know it probably feels like longer with Omicron. It's been 8 weeks.
The UK government controls mainstream media, and senior government ministers, civil servants and the media are implicated in the following alleged crimes. And evidence to support that has been submitted to Hammersmith CID. Crimes being cited are misfeasance in public office, misconduct in public office, conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm, conspiracy to administer a poisonous and noxious substance to cause serious harm and death, gross negligence manslaughter, corporate manslaughter, corruption, fraud, blackmail, murder, conspiracy to commit murder, terrorism, genocide, torture, crimes against humanity, false imprisonment, multiple breaches of our human rights, war crimes, multiple breaches of the Nuremberg Code 1947, multiple breaches of the Human Rights Act 1998, and I believe treason will also be added to that list.
As I said, that accounts for a third of all the COVID-19 infections we've seen thus far throughout this pandemic. A third of all the COVID-19 infections we've seen thus far throughout this pandemic. A third of all the COVID-19 infections throughout this pandemic. And I will come back in the spring and set out how we will live with COVID. But the way we are going to do this is that we are going to have to find a way to remove almost all of these restrictions and get life completely back to normal, but with one or two really big things that I think that will be there for a while. That is probably the need to vaccinate. I can't tell you how often. And I think antivirals and treatments. And I think testing. The vaccines, antivirals, monoclonal antibodies, and testing, I think they will be the cornerstone of our future defenses. You mentioned the number of people dying, and you mentioned the latest number. The numbers do vary day by day. There are some reporting differences on depending on which day of the week that is picked. But if you look at the average daily death rate, the 7-day average, I think it's around 200 in England, which is a lot lower than it's been before, and we want it to get lower. And there's something else I think is important to point out about the death rate. Which maybe Susan might expand on when I'd come to her. It is also with Omicron. We know that if we look at infections of people with COVID in hospital, we estimate around 40% of the people with COVID in hospital are there not because they've got COVID, they happen to have COVID. So it's what you might call an incidental infection. So they're not there being treated for COVID. They happen to have COVID. So it's what you might call an incidental infection. So they're not there being treated for COVID. And that's almost double the percentage that we saw with Delta. And that's important because the deaths that are being reported of people that were COVID positive within 28 days of passing away, that many of those people would not have necessarily died of COVID, And what we're seeing in hospitals, that proportion of roughly 40% not being there because of COVID, The ONS has very detailed data on that, which I think they'll come out with shortly, where they look at the actual cause of death on death certificates, and I think that will be important data when it comes. And I've got a job, and that's a very important job, and that's health and social care. My job is to make sure that health and social care is the very best it can be in this great country. Susan.
Great. So I'll take it in two parts. So first of all, on the deaths within 28 days, we regard this as a leading indicator and something we monitor very carefully.
The ONS has very detailed data on that, which I think they'll come out with shortly, where they look at the actual cause of death on death certificate.
But as the Secretary of State has said, it doesn't take into account people who've died with COVID.
40% not being there because of COVID.
Who've had a diagnosis, and given the very large number of cases that we've diagnosed in the last number of weeks.
So they're not there being treated for COVID.
We will sadly see some people, particularly the very elderly, who die within 28 days of a case of COVID.
40% not being there because of COVID. So they're not there being treated for COVID.
So we look very carefully at the ONS data, and ONS data release their data weekly.
The ONS has very detailed data on that, which I think they'll come out with shortly, where they look at the actual cause of death.
However, in the last 2 weeks, it's always lagged because the death registrations need to come through.
The actual cause of death on death certificate.
And ONS data release their data weekly, and we will continue to keep a monitoring on the number of deaths that we're seeing within 28 days, and the number of deaths that ONS are reporting that are on the death certificate.
The ONS has very detailed data on that, which I think they'll come out with shortly, where they look at the...
So therefore related to the death in some way.
British people, once they've seen the outcome of the investigation...
The law is the same whether you are a police constable in uniform or whether you are a citizen, a man or woman that is sovereign. The police have a duty. That duty is to respond and act accordingly. If the police fail to do their job, they are committing an offence of misconduct in public office and perverting the course of justice. If they know offenders are responsible for these crimes and they do anything to assist those offenders or prevent those crimes from being detected or deliberately frustrate the criminal investigation, they are also guilty of an offence of assisting a known offender. They've
heard the Prime Minister's response, then they can make an ultimate judgment for themselves, as they should.
Thank you.
Please, please do come forward and help yourself, your loved ones, and most of all, help our great country. Thank you. Thank you all very much.